I'm going to start. Today I have with me Howard Cruse, a comic book artist who has done many great books, including Stuck Rubber Baby, which was made in the 1990s, which really addressed racial tension as well as gay rights. So I'm going to start with the first question. How are you exposed to comic books?
Well, around my home in Alabama, somehow or other, there was some Little Lulu comics, um, and I quickly took to those. And Little Lulu was my favorite comic book. This was all, in the days when Wendell was king and way before the Marvel barrage. And but anyway, I read Little Lulu and Uncle Scrooge and Donald Duck and a lot of the funny comics, and I read Superman and Batman, which were about the number of superheroes I could keep in my head.
So obviously, reading all these comics, when did you decide that you wanted to write and draw comics?
Well, of course, I grew up, as is true probably with every cartoonist who's listening to this, just sort of discovering spontaneously that I enjoyed drawing. And then seeing comics led me to make up my own comics around the house, using crayons and whatever paper I could find. And when I was about 8, my father told me that some people made their living doing drawings. And that sounded real good to me because um, most of the adults in the small Alabama town I was living in were farmers, and I would visit their farms with my school classmates, and it was obvious that farming was really hard work. And the idea of making a living drawing pictures sounded really great. So I sort of set that as my career ambition from the word go. And I I read everything I could about being a cartoonist, and as soon as I learned such basics as drawing in India ink instead of pencils, and learned to make my work look a little more professional, even though when I look back at the drawings I was doing at that time, they're of course totally amateurish, but India ink made everything look more professional. And by the time I was in my teens, I was putting together proposals for newspaper comic strips and sending them to syndicate editors and getting rejected. And I did that periodically, into my early 20s. And I really didn't think in terms so much of comic books until the arrival of the underground comics movement, because by the time I got old enough to draw in any way that resembled professionalism, there basically were almost no more humor comics, which is what I would want to draw. And they were all these Marvel and DC superheroes, which had gotten very explosive and action-filled and fist-fight-filled. And that wasn't my temperament. So I had sort of given up on comic books as a possible ambition. And also I had become, while I was in college, I became involved in the college theater, and kind of thought maybe I would try to be a theater person professionally. But then after I got out of college and spent some time in New York, it was obvious that it was much more practical to be a cartoonist, because cartoonists don't have to find a whole group of people that want to do the same project that they want to do. Cartoonists can just go out and buy art materials and start drawing. So I returned to cartooning as an ambition, and underground comics gave me a way to have some of the freedom and potential depth that you could find in plays, on paper.
So you were very involved in underground comics, in particular with the company Gay Comics. How did you get involved with them?
Well, first there were a number of years doing comics that had no gay content for kitchen sink comics. I had a character named Barefoots, spelled with a Z, at the end. And it was, it occupied me through a lot of the 70s, but ultimately I felt I was going to have to move beyond it if I was going to take on more serious topics, because the style of it was just not terribly compatible with being serious. And so I had begun experimenting with new styles, and Dennis Kitchen, who had been publishing me all this time, we became aware just as friend to friend that I was gay. And so he suggested in 1979 that I edit a new series that would be gay comics. And I thought that would be a good way for me to come out professionally, because I had done a little bit of, by that time I had done a gay story in one of my Barefoots comics, but it didn't really make it clear that I was gay. And so editing gay comics gave me a chance to finish that little bit of being honest. And it also greatly improved my work, because I no longer was trying to preserve ambiguity about my gayness, and I could deal directly with gay topics and in the stuff that I did for gay comics. And also I could be a vehicle as editor of gay comics for giving more gay and lesbian cartoonists a chance to, to find a place to put their work.
So to talk about Barefoots for 1 second, obviously Barefoots has been met with positivity and negativity in the underground comic world.
Right.
Why do you feel that is? I guess people have two different views on it.
Well, a lot of the original underground comics readers who got into it through Zap Comics and all the Zap artists, and they became very committed to the idea that underground comics were inherently about breaking taboos and being revolutionary at every moment. And I, on the other hand, saw the underground comics movement as an opportunity to have simple freedom to be oneself. And if one wanted to break taboos or be S. Clay Wilson or something, you could do that. But you could also do comics that were less about breaking taboos and more about a kind of gentler satire, which is what I was interested in. Barefoots was an experiment in having a comic book series that on the surface looked like an innocuous comic strip that you might find on a newspaper comics page. But then the actual content of it, it had, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So it was kind of subversive under the surface, although it had a non-subversive surface. And I found that an interesting thing to play around with. And it gave me an opportunity to explore in a kind of parallel universe to the one we all live in, the impressions and thoughts about the nature of reality that I had gotten from experiments with psychedelic drugs during my early 20s. And so Barefoots was kind of cosmic and mystical and satirical, but it was not that much rooted in the kind of everyday world that we live in. And as I said earlier, a time came when I felt like if I was going to get more political and deal in a more gritty way with the world as it is, that I was going to have to leave behind the Barefoots universe and draw characters who looked a little bit more like real people.
So in the 1980s, you created a comic called Wendell.
Mm-hmm.
Where was your inspiration from Wendell came from?
Well, the Advocate, the gay news magazine, became aware of me mainly through a comic strips I did on gay topics for the Village Voice, and I did a very aggressive comic strip about anger at the anti-gay movements that were going on at the time. And the strip was called "Sometimes I Get So Mad," and the Advocate editors liked it and asked to reprint it, and so that put me in touch with the Advocate. And at that time, the Advocate was a tabloid. It had very large pages. And I would look at those pages and think, boy, that would be so great to have a comic strip that filled up one of those pages. And so I proposed that I do comic strips for them, and ultimately came up with the character of Wendell, who was a young gay man kind of exploring the gay subculture of that time, which was largely cruising and gay bar based, the singles culture. And so I was being funny through Wendell about the experiences that you might have if you went to gay bars or whatever. But then that happened to coincide with the rise of the AIDS epidemic, and I realized that it was getting harder to be lighthearted about one-night stands and gay bars and stuff like that. And I also became aware that, you know, I could reflect more of my life as I was living it by doing something about gay couples, particularly the process of becoming a gay couple of two guys finding ways to mesh their lives into a household, which was the experience I had been having for several years since I met my lover and now husband, Eddie Cedarbaum. And so that gave me a bunch of new material that really hadn't been covered in gay comic strips before. There had been lots of I say lots. There had been gay comic strips before about the sexual side of being gay, but this sort of homebody side of being gay had not been covered. And so I had lots of new territory I could plow with Wendell, and I kept doing that with a minor interruption in the middle of the 80s, all the way in between 1983 till 1989.
So to jump to the 1990s and how I actually came to know you, Stuck Rubber Baby, DC Comics was heavily involved in that. How did you get connected with DC Comics?
Well, DC Comics was the publisher of Stuck Rubber Baby, although their logo wasn't on it because they did it under what at the time was an experimental imprint designed to do creator-owned work that was out of the normal subject matter range of mainstream comics. Originally, the imprint was going to be called Piranha Press, and they had already published, a number of their experimental titles. And then the editor, Mark Nevelo, I proposed to him the possibility of me doing a graphic novel, which I would never have thought to do because would never have thought that an underground comic book person would have any place at DC Comics. But my friend Martha Thomases, who was a publicity person, who was the head of publicity at DC Comics at the time, told me about this Piranha imprint and said that might be a place for you. And to my pleasant surprise, Mark Nevelo was familiar enough with my underground comics work to be open to the idea, and we swapped ideas about what kind of graphic novel I might do, and arrived at this notion of making use of my experience as from many years before, when I had been a young gay man who was trying to be straight and who fell into a relationship with a girl, and we wound up conceiving a child. And this was, at the time, a somewhat new territory for a gay story. But it also allowed me to think back on my growing up time in Birmingham, Alabama, where there was obviously a huge amount of racial turmoil in the early 60s, and actually more than just the early 60s, but that's when the story of Stuck Rubber Baby mainly takes place. And so it gave me a chance to express some of my feelings about how my life had been changed by watching the civil rights movement up close, and how I had been affected by the girl who was the birth mother of my daughter, with whom I'm still friends. She changed my life by opening up my eyes, helping me become less self-involved and more aware of the world outside myself and things to care about besides my personal desires to be a cartoonist. And so in general, the book reflected, a whole lot of different themes that grew out of that period of my life. And I was also aware that many modern people were not aware of what the gay subculture might be like in the South 6 years before Stonewall. And, so this gave me a chance to portray something that hadn't been portrayed to death in the gay literature of the time. So it was very fertile ground, and I wanted fertile ground if I was going to do something that was 200 pages long. I wanted to make sure that there could be enough richness that it would feel like a real novel and not just a padded comic book story.
Also, I mean, the artwork in the book is amazing, where it's very realistic. What techniques did you use to bring that out?
Well, I was kind of forced into trying to draw more realistically than I had ever drawn before. My style, if you look back at my Barefoots years and even the Wendell years, is natively very cartoony. And but the story was just so, it depended on the feeling of living life in this world that was very dangerous and claustrophobic. And to do that, I had to include a greater sense of the environment that the characters were living in, and I needed texture and shadows and stuff, and there was just no way around it. I had to draw it in a more developed style. Although many people, have remarked in reviews that, well, that's not really realistic. Nobody really looks like the Stuck Rubber Baby characters, but close enough for the reader's imaginations to get involved in the story. And once you start introducing textures and shadows, you've got to have a shading technique. And also, I needed to have a shading technique, which turned out to be mainly cross-hatching with some stippling, because although I had African-American characters in Wendell, in general, the idea there was to have a few signifiers in the way they looked to indicate they were African-American, but I didn't do anything like darken their skin because it was about people. But in Stuck Rubber Baby, it was actually significant whether a character was black or white. And so I had to find a way of indicating that the black characters had a different skin tone than white characters. But I couldn't just shade the black characters, so I had to develop a shading technique that could be somewhat lighter for white people and darker, more, a lot more lines and cross-hatching for the African-American characters. And between that and the backgrounds, there was just no way around it. I had to devote a lot of time to that more elaborate style, which I spent a lot of the 4 years that it took me to draw the book. I was saying never again will I draw in this style. But it was a learning experience for me. And once I got into it, I realized there was nothing to do but just see it through and really commit myself to that style of drawing and do it as well as I was capable. So I came out with something that, I could take pride in, but not something that was an indicator of what I was going to draw like, for the rest of my career.
So do you feel that Stuck Rubber Baby has helped the gay rights movement and racial tensions in the United States when it came out?
I don't know about racial tensions. I think that, a number of African Americans who have read the book felt good about the way they were treated in it, and the fact that it was done by a white guy. They felt good that they didn't have to wince all the time, because it's so easy to make mistakes when you're drawing from a perspective that's outside of the group that you're drawing. But in general, I've found most black people who bothered to talk to me about it to have been appreciative of it. I don't know, whether. I think there's so many other things that have changed the world's view of racial issues, although we obviously have not gotten yet to where we need to be. Gay people, just as with Wendell, my goal was to get past the gayness as a somehow something that puts people in a special category and just draw them as everyday people with their flaws. And I mean, Toland is anything but some kind of heroic character. He spends much of the book being very afraid of himself and of trying to avoid committing himself. And it was fun for me to draw a character who was as flawed as Toland Polk, because Wendell essentially was a nice guy, and whereas Toland really could be a jerk, and that makes for more interesting conflicts in a story. But I think, I think the awareness of gay people in general has been increased by their presence in a lot of media, certainly not just my book. I mean, the fact that you have Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, not only as a hit book that was read by straight people and gay people alike, but also now the Broadway musical, which I saw a couple of weeks ago, and it's wonderful. And it's some reviewer remarked that it seemed to be the first Broadway musical that in which the leading character was lesbian, but the issue was not her lesbianism. It was about family issues. And I think raising the public's awareness that gay people are commonplace, everyday people, and some are terrific people and some are assholes, and that has been helpful to the public perception of gay people in general and the lessening of prejudice. But I could certainly not take special credit, because that's been happening in art that includes gay people all over the place, everything in comics and books and plays and TV shows. It's just been a revolution that has led to, such normalizing things as gay marriage.
So the comic world has obviously changing so rapidly in the last 5-6 years, with like big companies like Image Comics and Marvel increasing minorities in comics.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel that how that affects the LGBT community?
Well, considering that for most of my life, the world of mainstream comics was a world in which homosexuals did not exist at all. Any presence, and particularly any kind of positive treatment of gay characters, is an advance. There is a basic limit to how much you can portray about the lives that real people lead, when you got to do it in a genre format like superheroes. I appreciate the fact that gay characters. There's some gay characters in the superhero world. I think that's an advance, but it doesn't really say as much about real life experience as the stuff that's happening in the indie comics world, where there's a terrific amount of LGBT presence these days, and it's easy to find books drawn by many different cartoonists, many of them gay themselves or queer themselves, if to put all of those LGBT components into one word. They're there, they're doing cartoons that are very individual, and I think that's where the action is in terms of letting comics readers, particularly gay comics readers, feel like their lives are part of the world. So
to wrap this interview up, what advice do you want to give to people who want to get involved in advocacy, and as well as the comic book / cartoon industry?
Well, I think of in my private life, I'm an advocate, and in a sense, there's an advocacy inherent in simply saying, "Hey, gay people are real," or "Black people are real." They're not just stereotypes. However, I've always avoided trying to preach in comics, and my work has been about portraying life, not portraying lessons about life. And I think that's really the way to go if you want to create art that lives, because even though the particular issues of the day, will recede over time, human issues, the struggle of what to do if you're different from other people, what to do about power differentials in the world, all of these things, parents and children, all of this part of life, will continue to be part of life and will keep comics relevant for many years ahead. So I would encourage artists not to think in terms of teaching readers a lesson, but just be yourselves. See what you can learn, what you have learned about the way life works, and do comics, whether they're funny or adventurous or suspenseful or whatever, but root them in the world that the readers live in. And I think you'll end up with a powerful project.
Well, thank you so much for this interview. It's been a pleasure for me to interview you.
Well, I enjoyed it too. Thank you for calling on me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much again. And
Okay, let me know when this posts so I can tell my friends.
Oh, definitely.
Okay.